All right, everybody, thanks for coming. My name is Max Brooks. I'm here with my colleague, Lieutenant Colonel Matt Cavanaugh, U.S. Army, active duty. We're going to talk about our new book, Winning Westeros, How to Teach Strategy Through Game of Thrones. And all of this started many years ago. I don't know if you guys know what I do. I'm a full-time civilian and a writer, and I write about zombies and whatnot. But I also have a fellowship to a military think tank at the Modern War Institute up in West Point. And I got it because World War Z ended up on the required reading list at the Naval War College, and I started running in military circles, and suddenly I'm at the MWI, and I met this gentleman, and he came up with this idea. He said, look, I have taught at West Point, I've also served in Korea, and the one language that my cadets and my colleagues in the Republic of Korea Defense Forces understand is Star Wars. He said, I can talk to them about anything if I talk to them through the language of Star Wars. They all get it. And he said, what if we got a bunch of thinkers, smart people? He said, Max, here's my idea. We get together active duty military, important thinkers, editors, intellectuals, and you, and we put together a book of how to teach strategy through Star Wars. And I said, let's do it. And we came up with Strategy Strikes Back, how to teach military thinking through Star Wars. And it did so well, they said, let's do it again. And so we came up with teaching strategy through Game of Thrones. Take it away, Matt.
Yeah, if you get on Google and you say Game of Thrones lessons on, and then just leave it open-ended, what you'll find is that you can get the meaning of life out of Game of Thrones, you can get the perfect wedding out of Game of Thrones. But what we really all know is that Game of Thrones, at its heart, at its core, is about war, right? And there are things on screen, little bits and pieces that can help you better understand war in the real world by paying attention to something in a work of fiction. And it turns out the world loves to watch a war. You know, if we have a discussion about Afghanistan, not a whole heck of a lot of folks would show up. But when Max talks about nation building in our book on Star Wars, he uses the guise of nation building on Endor using the Ewoks. It's an allegory, and it's a fantastic one. Or in the real world of war, we have walls, we have weapons, and we have warriors. So a lot of you probably know George R.R. Martin, when he wrote the series, was inspired to design the wall based off of a visit he took in the early 80s to Hadrian's Wall. Some of you know that when you saw that iconic Battle of the Bastards scene, the showrunners, D.B. Weiss and David Benioff, they based that off of the Battle of Cannae and some of the carnage in 1864 in our own Civil War. So there are things that you can watch on screen that are entertaining, but that we can translate into real lessons in the real world. And you don't have to be all that sharp to figure out that watching that series, war is agony, it's misery, peace is precious. So that's something that, you know, in most of our writing, it's hard to convey. It's hard to, you know, translate that from words into other minds. But we can use a series that's so popular and so inviting and so interesting and use it as a launching pad to better understand our real world.
Yeah, and that's sort of why I chose to come on and do these two books, because now that I'm sort of running in these military circles, I go to a lot of conferences. You know, places like Special Operations Command and the Army's Training and Doctrine Command, and it's rooms full of uniforms and PhD and me, and I listen to the people that shape our world. I listen to these people working in artificial intelligence, and what does that mean, and cyber warfare, and what does it mean, information warfare, all these things. We have environmental scientists come and talk about how climate change is going to affect future conflict. Who in the world is it going to make poor? And those poor people are going to get angry, and those angry people are going to pick up guns, and then you have a war on your hands. So I listen to all these crazy, mind-blowing ideas, and then I go home to my hotel room, because I'm just fried by the end of the day, and I order like a pizza, and I put on CNN, and guess how many of these topics are mentioned? None of them. And you know, I'm old enough to have a dad who fought in World War II. And my parents of that generation would tell me how, like, the American people, even if you weren't in World War II, you understood it because the media, Hollywood, entertainment, they tried to put that knowledge in. I mean, to this day, my son, he loves Disney, and he has all the old Disney classics. I know how to strip a Canadian anti-tank rifle because Goofy taught me in a Disney cartoon. You understood the world back then. But now there's like this class of people who know everything, and the rest of us who don't know anything, and we're just entertaining ourselves, and then we wonder, like, gee, why is America involved in like 6 major wars? We don't know any of this stuff. So how do these people educate us? The voters, right? We live in a democracy. We are the boss. We make the decisions. How do you do it? Well, you do it through entertainment. You take something fun and cool like Game of Thrones that has castles and dragons and incest. Lot of incest. Wow. But then you can either look at it as pure entertainment, or you can take lessons from it and go, oh, okay, this is how things work. It's like my essay in the Game of Thrones book is about Micah the Butcher's son. Remember him? Because I go to a lot of Comic-Cons, that's my world. You know, that's my active duty. And I see a lot of people dressed like Daenerys and Jon Snow. I don't see nobody dressed like the Butcher's kid. Or my other favorite character, remember when Cersei blows up the tower and the bell goes flying through the air and then it squashes some poor little CGI extra, like some peasant who just was like living in, you know, King's Landing. Nobody's dressed like him because he doesn't matter. Because Micah, the Butcher's son, doesn't matter in that world. In the world of Westeros, where there's millions of people, there's like 12 characters making decisions for millions of people. And in this country, we love to complain about the government, right? We love to complain about, you know, government moves so slowly, Congress dithers, you know, we've got all these lawyers, things always take forever. And now you have a section of politicians who say, like, we need to get rid of the deep state. We need to argue against the government. Well, it is this slow-moving government that would save Micah the Butcher's son. They didn't have none of that in Westeros. There was no lawyers. There was no courts. There was no free press. There was nobody who said, wait a minute, Joffrey. You don't get to execute someone because he pushed you. There's a system of laws that is above you. Not in Westeros. So my essay was all about how Game of Thrones proves why democracy matters. Because even if you have a good king, because that's the premise, right? We all looked at Jon Snow and everyone's like, ooh, Jon Snow, he's so wonderful. Yeah, you know who else was young and cool and idealistic? Young Fidel Castro, right? Young Robert Mugabe, young Muammar Gaddafi. Let me tell you something. Young Muammar Gaddafi, if you went to college with him, he would have been that guy that always got laid at parties. Young Gaddafi was like handsome and idealistic. He wanted to save the people. But you give them 30 years of absolute power, then they become a crooked tyrant. And that's what I wrote about. Now, Matt's going to tell you about what he wrote about, which blew my mind, dragons as air power. And what that means when you bomb the crap out of people who didn't have a say.
Yeah, there are a lot of folks that look at dragons and they see nuclear weapons, but really this is more conventional air power, more like a normal Air Force, whether it be strategic bombing or whether it be air-ground integration. But one of the things that I get out of the series, sort of a meta-narrative, is the fact that the Night's Watch over time withered and became smaller and more separate and more distant from their society. And when they saw a threat coming and tried to raise the red flag and let the rest of the seven kingdoms know, they were unlistened to because they were so distant and different. And when Sam Tarly goes down to the Citadel and tries to get the academics in the series interested in the problem, they sort of dismissed it. Because they too were locked in at sort of an ivory tower in the Citadel, and they were distinct and different and separate from society. That's really, in a lot of ways, why this book exists, because people like me that do what I do for a living in the military, we're getting smaller and smaller, and we need more and more bridges to connect with everyone else in America. You know, we need to have conversations about national security. Max was talking about how many conflicts we're involved with, but the post 9/11 wars are estimated to cost $6 trillion through mid-century. 7,000 soldiers have died. 250,000 civilians have been killed in those conflicts. And so these are important issues. And if people are interested in Game of Thrones, then let's have that conversation starting there, and then sort of try and use a little jujitsu and get it over towards the real world as well. The upshot to me is that democracy is a conversation, and it's one that we need to have and we need to continue to have. Not like the Night's Watch getting separated, and not like the Citadel becoming separate as well. Because in the Game of Thrones, you win or you die. In democracy, you win or your people are crying. They cry. Beto O'Rourke, when he lost his run for the Senate in Texas, no one executed him because he might be a threat someday down the line. That might have happened in the Game of Thrones. So recognizing that this is meant to be a conversation, the book is meant to ignite a conversation, what we'd like to do is pass the microphone around to you and open up the floor to some questions. Any questions that you might have, and if you run a little bit low on them, trust me, we've got plenty for, like that we can just play ping pong up here, but we'd much rather hear what you'd like to know.
I have a question about the strategies of warfare that they used in Game of Thrones. My boyfriend was yelling at the screen because he's like, I'm a medieval historian and I study this and this and this, and they would never put the Dothraki in front and flank it like that. This is an outrage. Are any of the strategies, the military tactics that they use, accurate? Did they do any research for that?
So I'll lead off, and I'll be very quick and turn it over to Max. So yes and no. So for example, the Battle of the Bastards was mapped out almost step for step, like what you would have seen at Cannae 2,000 years ago. So that maneuver is what's referred to as a double envelopment, which is sort of like a lobster's claws closing around an opponent. The Dothraki in the front, traditionally, as a cavalryman myself, you send a cavalry force out, a maneuverable force out in front of the main body of the attack, in order to better understand, to be the eyes and the ears of the attack to come, so that you feel out through the fighting what the opponent has and is prepared to unleash on you. Correct, but you don't use scouts at night. So that's kind of the thing. However, when the enemy gets a vote. So if the enemy is attacking at night, you very well might have to. So it's not what I would have done. However, nobody asked me. For a few bucks, I might have tipped them off. But one other thing that I want to draw out, and that's the strategic thought and instinct of Jon Snow. So one element that I identified from the series was that Jon Snow, you see an awful lot of characteristics that he held in common with George Washington, who lost many battles but won the war in part because he did such an effective job at forging alliances. Alliances that you never would have expected, and getting people to cooperate and fight together in ways that didn't seem possible beforehand. George Washington did it with unruly Northeasterners and Virginians. Jon Snow did it with, I mean, geez, pretty much everybody. He cooperated with everybody in ways that was beneficial to his side, but strategically devastating to the other side.
Thank you.
I do have a question about leadership. The leadership between Jon Snow and Tyrion Lannister, because I do see similarities, parallels between the two. I think Jon Snow was more idealistic, but Tyrion was more realistic. So how would that work? Well, it worked out well for him.
Yeah, see, now this she's asking about the relationship between Jon Snow and Tyrion Lannister and sort of how would that work out? And that illustrates the problem of a monarchy. See, a democracy is all supposed to be something called a meritocracy, where if you're the right person for the right job, you get the job. Now, it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes it's the person who talks the loudest or whatnot. But theoretically, there should be nothing to stop that person. If they were in a republic like what we have, people would vote for Tyrion. Well, they might not vote for Tyrion because they'd be like, oh, I don't like the way he looks. But you could fake it. You know, Franklin Roosevelt faked the fact that he had polio. He made sure nobody ever photographed him in a wheelchair because he didn't want to look weak. And, you know, if you go to the White House, there's actually a block of wood at the desk of the president that Roosevelt put in there so nobody would see that he was in a wheelchair. So Tyrion is the smartest guy. He should be president. Duh. But because he didn't have the right blood, that's the whole thing about blood right, how you were born. And that's a monarchy. Oh, you have the right blood right. That's the whole thing at the end, remember? They're like, oh no, we've done the research and we've looked. You're the rightful king. You're rightful because of the way. No. You can't hear this. You have to turn away. Eric Trump does not have the blood right to be the commander-in-chief of the armed forces simply because his daddy is presently the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. That's not how it should work.
Can I uncover now?
Yeah, okay, you can uncover now. So this notion of blood right is the reason that people don't even consider Tyrion as the commander-in-chief, because his family has fallen out of favor. What? Anyone else?
Thanks. Back to Tyrion. I have always been thinking Tyrion is a smart guy, and he really is the king in the end because he's really just puppet stringing the, what's his name, Bran?
Yeah.
Wheelchair guy. And the reason they don't make him king is because he's a dwarf. Let's be honest about this. And also, is Jon Snow that smart? He should have killed Grey Worm, so would you agree?
So it's interesting about Jon Snow. I wrote a chapter about Jon. This actually relates to the last question because what I see is a pragmatic moralist. So someone who is looking to do what is morally right, but willing to bend when necessary. And you saw the same thing with Ned Stark. He's sitting in that prison. He knows he's going to die. He's willing to die to do what he sees is right, but in the end, he's willing to be morally flexible in order to do to save his children, because that's sort of the condition of his plea for his life, that if he agrees that Joffrey and Cersei should lead, then his children will be spared their fate.
Now, and we disagree on Stark in one way because, see,
Yeah.
I see Ned Stark as an example of Albert Speer. Has anyone ever heard of Albert Speer? All right, Albert Speer was Hitler's personal architect. He was an architect, just liked building stuff, and young Hitler came along and was like, wow, you should build stuff for me. And then he was like, hey, Speer, you're such a good architect. I'd like you to become Reichsminister for Armaments. So you'll be my guy building weapons. And Speer then used slave labor and worked them to death and took people out of concentration camps and made them work to make weapons. Then Speer was put on trial at the end of the war. And here's the thing. A lot of Nazis were so conditioned, were such robots, that they literally, even on the stand, were like, we did nothing wrong. We did nothing wrong. Following orders. Albert Speer admitted it. Albert Speer came out and said, yeah, it was totally wrong. And I knew it was wrong, and I did it anyway. That's Ned Stark.
So, and I'm going to disagree.
Right.
So Ned Stark has a set of ideals that draw others to him, and even when he's killed, those ideals live on.
Right.
Now, that stable, consistent behavior enables alliances and then lines to continue after his death.
Shouldn't Grey Worm have been killed both for moral reason as well as for practical reasons? Because, you really need to get rid of that guy.
Grey Worm had suffered enough.
So, good answer.
Hi. Going back to some of the original comments you were making, I want to talk about or ask about the siloed thinking that you deal with that you also talked about in the world of Game of Thrones. You talked about how nobody listens to each other. There's people just in their own world. How do you suggest using pop culture like this to cross those boundaries?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, pop culture starts with, I think, just almost an osmosis. You can, for example, watch Game of Thrones and realize how cruel and random war is. So, one example from my own life, in 2003, just after the invasion of Iraq, our unit, one of our tank drivers crested a small hill in the middle of the desert in the middle of nowhere in Iraq, and the tank went nose down into a wadi, which is like a pond in the desert, and the hatch got stuck, the turret got stuck in the mud, and he drowned in the hatch. So the irony and the horribleness of drowning in the desert, I think, is every bit as gut-wrenching as watching Hodor die. And if a fan can watch that scene where Hodor dies and feel a sense of pain from that, then you're getting a fraction of what it's like to be in a real war and lose a real soldier. So there's sort of an empathy or a feeling that you can get out of a series that I think you can't necessarily get just off the printed page. More specifically, though, I think that we can use fiction in an exploratory fashion or to exploit fiction. So a little over 100 years ago, H.G. Wells was writing about land dreadnoughts. And about a decade later, there were some military officers in the British Army that used some of those ideas to build the first tanks. So none of that happens, though, if we wall ourselves off from one another. If the military goes off and we do stuff on little bases in podunk America, if academia stays locked in the Citadel or the Ivory Tower, or if writers and fiction authors never leave LA County. Escape from LA. We were just talking about Snake Plissken and Escape from LA like 5 minutes ago. And so this book is not just a conversation between people with short haircuts and people with longer haircuts. It's also to gather up a bunch of different folks that do what I do and write collaboratively with people that can really help those of us in uniform. So in the Second World War, a lot of you know that Dr. Seuss was a lieutenant in the Army. Frank Capra made movies for the Army. This is the modern day version of that. Max is contributing in his own creative way to the strategic advantage of our country. So that's how we try to break the stovepipes. We're not always successful, but this book, got the ball forward a little bit.
And by the way, as I'm sure you know, that's how science fiction used to be. This is nothing. We're not inventing anything new. We're going back to the way it used to be. Every episode of Star Trek was about the real world, and that carried over into the next generation, where you'd watch it, it would be interesting, and then later you'd be like, oh my God, they weren't just talking about a race of people where you're black on one side and white on the other. This is race relations. I mean, I remember an episode of the original Star Trek where they predicted political correctness 30 years earlier. Remember where Abraham Lincoln, he goes to the Enterprise, and he says to Lieutenant Uhura, he says, what a charming negress. And he says, oh, I'm terribly sorry, I did not mean to offend. And she says, Mr. President, in my time, we've learned not to be afraid of words. Wow. What a goal. What a goal for a society that we learn not to be afraid of words. And the vision that Gene Roddenberry had for Star Trek was a vision for America. I mean, I don't know if you know the story about when Nichelle Nichols was going to quit Star Trek. She's like, I'm just not getting enough. And then she runs into Martin Luther King, who says, no. You are giving a vision of what life could be for this country. You need to stay on this show. And so that's what science fiction is supposed to do. It's supposed to entertain in the moment and educate afterwards. Other questions?
Hi.
Hi.
So first, I wanted to thank you for your service. Something that continuously frustrated me was Euron Greyjoy and how he continuously did like sneak attacks, how this giant fleet was able to surprise Dany and her forces. How did this giant fleet come out of nowhere and surprise them? Is this realistic or was this Hollywood?
December 7th, 1941.
Touche. Okay. But even up in the air, even when Dany was up in the air, how could she not? How could nobody have ever anticipated Euron?
So it depends to the depths you're willing to suspend disbelief. But I can tell you our foreword was written by Admiral James Stavridis, former Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, who wrote how much he loved seeing the Iron Fleet be so successful. So in modern day, we likely have reconnaissance platforms that would have identified that ship. Remember that even when you're flying, your line of sight is relatively limited, because you're just trying to keep your, stay on the dragon, I guess. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know. But
I'll
he
give you
was
an example.
entertaining.
I'll give you an example from history. 1967, Six-Day War, Israeli Air Force dominates the Middle East.
Yeah.
The Israeli Air Force destroys the whole Egyptian Air Force on the ground. 1973 comes along, Egypt pulls a sneak attack on Israel's holiest of days. Oh my God. But Israel is thinking, well, we still have our Air Force. We'll do it again. But in between 1967 and 1973, a brand new invention. Just like the Scorpions in Game of Thrones, they invent the SA-6. The Soviets invent a surface-to-air missile. Faster, smaller, much more accurate than the old big SA-2s. So the Israeli Air Force goes up, ready to just whomp on the Egyptian army, and suddenly, like the dragons, they're like, oh my God, what are these things? These SA-6 SAMs are just knocking Israeli planes out of the sky. And they knew, and they had planned, but they weren't ready. Exactly like the dragons were not ready. And this happens in war. A new technology comes along, and it catches everybody by surprise.
Hi. Yeah, I'm over here. Just first off, I really appreciate that you guys are trying to use pop culture to begin topics about your narrative. I'm a counselor. I work in schools. I use the same thing, video games, pop culture, to try and relate mental health stuff to the kids. And just, it's really nice to see other people are trying to reach the barrier through any ways possible, because these are such topics that people just brush off these days. But I have a real question. Okay, so back in the day, and I know in Game of Thrones, they try to use like political marriages and other like subtle social things for like national security. And I was just wondering, what does that look like nowadays, if we even know?
You mean, like, could I get married to Kim Jong-un and make the world a more peaceful place?
I mean, if you're willing, go for it. Consent, let's go.
I don't know. The ring's already on my finger. So we just do it in a different way. The marriage is intended to signify an ongoing commitment. And to some extent, the reason we've gotten past those is not that it wasn't effective. It's that, for example, the relationship that in Korea, for example, I was serving on the Korean Peninsula a couple years ago. Our military and economic relationship with the South Koreans is certainly of longer duration and even greater stability than a marriage might be able to make it. And I can say that as someone who's been married for a decade too.
I didn't mean just marriages. I mean, like, the Olympics is supposed to bring the world together, like, just other social things.
There's
like,
a lot. There's marriages of economies. Thomas L. Friedman, the writer, he wrote about two countries cannot go to war if they both have a McDonald's. See, it was easier for us to have a conflict with the Russians in the Cold War because our economies weren't entwined. So nowadays, if you have an investment in another country, you're hurting yourself. If you start bombing those factories, those might very well be yours. So that a marriage of economies is important, and another one is a marriage of cultures. I was actually at a DC think tank talking to, I won't say who, but it's a Middle Eastern country we're supposedly friends with. What he didn't understand was there's a difference between a friend and an ally. Culturally, like, we're married to Japan. Their culture's embedded in ours. If Japan was ever attacked, we would feel as a nation we've got to protect our friends. Some of these Middle Eastern countries, not so much. We're dating them. We ain't married to them. And it's a toxic relationship with some of them.
Just so we're clear, I'm an active duty Army officer. Max speaks for himself, not for the U.S. government. I doubt that we really conceive of our relationship with the Saudis as a one-night stand, but...
I didn't say Saudi Arabia. I just said a Middle Eastern country.
Yeah, just so you know, we're at our time limit, but I think we can keep going if that's okay. I don't know whether or not there's an additional... Is there anyone coming right after us, or five more minutes?
We got 5 more
okay,
minutes.
we
So
can keep
another
going.
question. Oh yeah, this young lady with the red hair had her hand up like the moment we opened the floor to questions.
Wow. John Cena must have cracked a walnut with his bicep.
Hi. So I actually work in the entertainment industry and specifically in advertising. So I hear a lot of companies trying to build bridges with people just like the military. And I think what's interesting with the military is there's the idea of also propaganda being an issue. So kind of where is the line between propaganda and then actually building genuine bridges?
That's a really interesting question. In part, on June 6th, I just wrote an LA Times op-ed that'll be out that day. Because it was about Robert Capa, who took photos of what happened on the beach at Normandy on June 6th, 1944. And some of those images are violent and frightening, but they were critical in helping the public understand what was happening on the beach in France. And now we're having a fairly large public discussion over what gory and grisly images are acceptable to be shared on social media. It's a fine line. It's because those images can be used as a weapon. I don't know necessarily what the right answer is, because you don't want pure censorship and you don't want a single hand, beauty being identified by the eye of one beholder, the government. But at the same time, you don't want to censor, you don't want a private organization like Facebook or some other social media company censoring either. So this is a job best tackled by an unruly mob known as a democracy, right? Like, and the sort of sum total of our aesthetic judgment. I mean, that one's a hard. There's a fine line between propaganda and the right way.
And that's why you have a free press. Like my boss at the Modern War Institute, Colonel Liam Collins, he's a Green Beret. He's one of those guys who like disappears for 6 months. But he has a phrase: "It's not propaganda if it's true." And that's why you have a free press to check what the government is saying. So like in Vietnam, when the government was lying, the press would be like, "No, that's not true. You know, the VC didn't destroy that village, we did." But nowadays, you need a public-private partnership. So let's say our government, our State Department, comes out with a statement and says, the Chinese are putting Muslims in camps. The Chinese are putting thousands of Uyghur minority Muslims in re-education camps to beat the culture out of them so they'll be more compliant. And then you as a citizen say, well, I don't know about that. Well, you fact check it with Amnesty International that goes, yeah, that's totally true. We're Amnesty International. We don't work for the State Department or the CIA. We're an independent human rights watch group. That is exactly true. And that's why in our country, you check each other and you vet each other. And so when people say, well, what's true, what's not? There's enough consensus that you know that people who have different agendas, if they all agree on something, yeah, it's true. And we should be trumpeting that. We should be trumpeting that we are in conflict with countries who want to change the world in a different way than we want to live. And we should be calling them out on that. And so that's what I believe as a private citizen as far as what is propaganda. It ain't propaganda if it's true.
I think we got time for one more.
One more question.
Hello. Thank you so much. I'm really enjoying this discussion a lot. When you were talking about people who kind of start out very idealistic and charismatic, I know it's really controversial because Daenerys has a big fan base, but I kind of saw this coming, even though they did it in a crazy way that was not the greatest, but I did see it coming. So what is your opinion on kind of Daenerys' character evolution? You know, is this something you saw coming? And also, so I've heard of some people comparing, you know, Daenerys' kind of exploits in Essos and comparing them to like U.S. imperialism. Do you see that connection? Do you not see that connection? Can you speak on that?
I'll set aside the imperialism part.
Yeah.
But the Twitterverse exploded after the end of the series, right? A lot of folks were just disappointed for a lot of reasons, some of them really important and valid, collapsing the storyline so quickly at the end, seemingly just to get it done. I sort of took a step back and said, now, I mean, to be honest, America knows a little bit more about what it's like to be involved with a conflict for so long. So I went to Iraq for a few years of my life. To some extent, I don't think anyone who's come home from a war or spent that much time as part of a conflict has ever felt good about it when it was over. Maybe the folks in the Second World War, a couple of victory parades, but my grandparents were alcoholics when they came back, so it wasn't as if they.
My dad wouldn't relive that for anything.
Yeah. So the takeaway that I get is that the dissatisfaction that people feel from the end of the series, I think actually replicates and echoes the real world. As far as Daenerys goes, people do things at war that they never would do in real life. I could elaborate on that, but I won't. But to be mindful of time. But as good as someone looks for a time, when they have ultimate power, the context changes, and they can change too.
And also, when you talk about American imperialism, what do you mean by that? We have corporations that would love to get their hands on the world's resources. We have certain politicians that would love to do that. But that's the point of a democracy. We're not, as a nation, we're not imperialist. If we were, Iraq wouldn't be a mess because it would be the 51st state. The problem is we're isolationists. That's America's problem, is we go into a country, we kick over the anthill, and then we immediately say, when can we leave? And then you have people saying, no, you mess with a country, you're there. You better fix what you broke. But America, we're just like, well, when can we leave, when can we leave, when can we leave? If the Chinese had gone in, there'd be no more Iraq, just like there's officially no such thing as a Tibet. That's exactly why my book, World War Z, was censored in China. Tibet doesn't exist. They're there. 100 years ago, when the British went into a place, they rolled up the flag and served the tea. That's it. We ain't leaving. So I think America's problem is not that we want to grab. It's the problem that we want to come in as a geostrategic booty call, and then we're Billy Crystal and When Harry Met Sally putting our pants on the next day going, yeah, Iraq, I'll call you. Afghanistan, I'll call you. Yeah. What? No? I have to stay?
That was a very awkward conversation at the end of the Iraq War.
It really was.
So I think we're over our time. We have extra copies of the book, I think, in the back. Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it.